The Arthur Dozier Industrial School for Boys was a place where nightmares were born. In 1900, the state of Florida opened its first reform school for troubled boys. From its inception, it was supposed to be a refuge for young males. The boys who found themselves at the Dozier School came from varied and often troubled backgrounds. Many were sent for minor infractions such as truancy, running away from home, or petty theft. These boys were not hardened criminals, but rather children who had made mistakes or who had been abandoned by society, such as orphans or even children from abusive households. However, little was done to rehabilitate the boys at Dozier. The staff, poorly trained and often cruel, saw the boys as problems to be controlled, not children to be helped. Hard labor and discipline ruled the days, and depravity the nights. The reality of life at Dozier was far from the initial vision of reform and care. Most boys left with physical and emotional scars, while others never left at all. Daily life at the Arthur Dozier School for Boys was a far cry from the structured, rehabilitative environment it was meant to be. From dawn until dusk, the boys were subjected to a strict and often brutal schedule. The day began early, with a wake-up call at 5 a.m. The boys would then march to the mess hall, where breakfast was served. The meals were meagre, often consisting of oatmeal and bread. Malnutrition was common, and the boys were constantly hungry. After breakfast, the boys were divided into groups and sent off to their assigned tasks. Most of the African American boys were tasked with working the school's fully functioning farm, toiling under the hot Florida sun. Most of the white students worked in the school's woodshop or brick factory. The boys were supposed to be learning workplace skills they could use in later life. However, the school staff seemed more focused on profiting from its farm production and brick factory. Educational resources were limited, with insufficient textbooks, materials, and qualified teachers. Classrooms were often overcrowded and poorly equipped. The boys learned little, and the focus was far more centered on discipline. Discipline at Dozier was enforced through a regime of fear. The staff employed a range of punishments, from solitary confinement to beatings with a leather strap. Evenings provided little respite. After a sparse dinner, the boys were locked in their dormitories, where the lack of supervision often led to further violence and abuse among the inmates. This was the daily reality for the boys at Dozier, an existence marked by hunger, hard labor, and constant fear. The promise of reform and care was nothing more than a cruel illusion. On the sprawling campus of Dozier, the White House was a small, unassuming concrete block building painted white. It had a simple utilitarian design, which contrasted sharply with the horrors that took place inside. It was utilized for corporal punishment. Boys were dragged there for sometimes the slightest infractions. They came for them at night, pulled from their cottages and instructed to line up on the wall. One by one, they would be brought into a small room where a group of fully grown men would take turns beating them. A loud industrial fan would be switched on to muffle the screams. Survivors described being whipped with a thick leather strap until they lost consciousness. A trip to the White House left them bloodied and broken. One survivor recalls, "The screams of boys being beaten still haunt me. It was like living in a horror movie that never ended." But the physical abuse was only part of the torment. Psychological abuse was rampant. After a visit to the White House, a boy would be placed into solitary confinement. They were left in dark, hot and cramped cells for days or even weeks following their beatings. Isolation after a physical assault can severely worsen psychological effects on juveniles, leading to intensified trauma, heightened anxiety, and severe PTSD. It increases feelings of abandonment and fear, hinders emotional recovery, and raises the risk of self-harm. Another horrific reality was that some staff members preyed on the boys, exploiting their power to commit unspeakable acts. The trauma from such violations left deep emotional scars that many survivors carry to this day. Fear and shame kept the boys silent about what occurred. Those dared to speak out about their time at Dozier were often dismissed or ignored due to their socio-economic status. There were whispers in the community of Marianna about what went on at the reform school, but a culture of silence pervaded. Dozier provided the few decent jobs available in the rural community. How could something like this happen for over a century without it being investigated? The truth is that Dozier operated under a cloud of suspicion from nearly the outset. In 1903, the Florida legislative investigation revealed serious overcrowding and poor sanitation. Investigators found children in shackles and commented that it looked more a prison than a school. In 1914, a tragic fire claimed the lives of 6 boys who were locked in their dormitory rooms and were unable to escape the blaze. In 1934, an Inspector General's report uncovered systemic physical abuse, a lack of proper medical care and undernourishment. Limited actions were taken to address the findings. In March of 1958, Miami psychologist and former Dozier School staff member Dr. Eugene Byrd testified before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee that the children were viciously whipped with a leather strap. The blows were severe, said Dr. Byrd, and it was sheer brutality. This would lead to the temporary suspension of some staff members and other small reforms. In 1968, social worker Lenora May reported on the severe physical and psychological abuse occurring at Dozier. Her findings led to an investigation by the U.S. Department of Health, Education and Welfare. That same year, Florida Governor Claude Kirk visited the Dozier School and found holes in leaking ceilings, broken walls, bucket toilets, bunk beds crammed together, overcrowding, and a lack of heat in the winter. Kirk said of the school that it was a training ground for a life of crime, and that if one of your kids were kept in such circumstances, you'd be up there with rifles. In 1969, a reporter visited the school and found a 16-year-old boy in solitary confinement. The boy had eaten a light bulb and used a glass diffuser from a lighting fixture to slash himself arm a dozen times. Around that time, a U.S. Department of Health official labeled Dozier School an absolute monstrosity. After federal investigations of the early 1970s, reports indicated that while some progress was made, the integration process was slow, and many black students continued to face harsher treatment and poorer conditions compared to their white counterparts. In 1982, a class action lawsuit was filed against the Dozier School for Boys by former students alleging severe physical and sexual abuse. The state settled out of court, agreeing to compensate victims and implement reforms. In 2007, the FBI's Department of Juvenile Justice launched an investigation following multiple reports of abuse. This investigation would be the beginning of the end for the Dozier School. The FBI investigation revealed that the staff used excessive force, including the use of prone restraints. This sometimes occurred in off-camera areas not subject to administrative review. Youth were often disciplined for minor infractions through inappropriate uses of solitary confinement. The FBI found the state failed to provide appropriate mental health services to address many of the needs of the students. From July 2004 to March 2009, the Florida Department of Children and Families investigated 316 allegations of abuse at the Dozier School, 17 of which were verified and 33 of which had some indicator of legitimacy. After a 2007 abuse incident was caught on a security camera and uploaded to YouTube, state officials criticized the Dozier School for operational problems spanning the chain of command from top to bottom and fired the superintendent. Finally, in 2011, the Dozier School for Boys was officially closed after 111 years of operation. Ironically, the state of Florida cited budgetary cuts as its reasoning for the closure. Since the closure of the Dozier School for Boys in 2011, significant efforts have been made to uncover and address its dark legacy. In 2012, the University of South Florida Department of Anthropology began excavations on the school grounds. Dozier had its own cemetery on campus known as Boot Hill. It had about 24 graves marked with small white crosses. A 2014 USF report confirmed 55 burials, revealing significant discrepancies in official records, which only accounted for 24 deaths at Dozier. This raised troubling questions over the fate of those who were unaccounted for. Some of the remains recovered showed signs of blunt force trauma. Others were matched to children listed as missing in school records. The USF report also noted the following. 1. There was a high correlation between deaths following escape attempts. A high number of deaths occurred within the deceased child's first 3 months of confinement. 2. There was an inconsistency in the issuance of death certificates or grave markers. 3. There was a consistent underreporting of deaths by school administrators to the state. Taken together, this information suggested to the USF team an intent on the part of former Dozier School administrators to obfuscate the true number of burials on school property and to hinder later potential investigations into the true causes of specific individuals' deaths. The legacy of Arthur Dozier Reform School serves as a somber reminder of the importance of justice and accountability. In recent years, the state has taken steps to compensate the victims of the Arthur Dozier Reform School. The White House Boys, a group of survivors, have been instrumental in bringing attention to the abuses that occurred. A memorial has been established in their honor, and a ceremony was held to seal the White House, symbolizing the end of a dark chapter in history. Efforts are ongoing to ensure that the horrors of Dozier are never forgotten and that future generations are protected. Survivors continue to share their stories, not just as a form of personal healing, but as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Their voices resonate far beyond the confines of the past, inspiring a collective movement towards justice and reform. As they rally together, there is a renewed sense of hope. Their legacy is one of strength, courage, and an unwavering commitment to ensuring that such darkness never overshadows our history again. This video is part of that effort and is dedicated to those who suffered and died at the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys.